Case study 2, privacy versus security. You know that law enforcement wiretaps phones belonging to suspects. Of course, each country is different. In most countries, the law enforcement can ask for the court permission to wiretap phones, and that's considered to be normal, to wiretap phones of suspects. Prior to cellular technology, to mobile phone technology, a wiretap was an actual physical split off between from the main line of the phone into the building. So there was actually a split where the line would go to the recipient, and also a copy of it goes to the law enforcement. Modern use of mobile phones and voice over IP complicates phone taps. However, most, and if not all, computer phone calls go through computer systems. So some laws, especially in the US, I'm not sure about here, require that all telecommunications companies should support what it's called lawful intercept or LI systems for wiretaps. Basically, this book was published in the United States, and in the United States, it's a requirement for the telecommunications company to have the machinery for allowing lawful intercept of mobile phone technology, mobile phone calls. Is it good or bad? Well, we don't know. That's the question. Is it ethical or not? That's the question. There's been cases where built-in LI systems, built-in lawful intercept systems, were targeted by hackers. In Greece, hackers wiretapped 100 major businesses and political leaders, and no trace of who did it or why was found. Here comes the ethical question. How does the decision to require lawful intercept software impact privacy and security? Now, let's introduce another variety of ethical reasoning, that is ethical reasoning by analogy. We all know how to make analogies, so the idea then is to get the problem. Now the problem is whether the lawful intercept software impact privacy or security. Let's find an analogy that's common to us that would help us analyze the problem. And we have to bear in mind that analogies are never perfect. We should extract from the analogies the aspects that are important for the understanding of the problem. So making sure that the similarities between the two domains, the domain that you want to analyze and the analogous domain, are the points that we are interested in analyzing in the question, in the problem. And that the differences, the dissimilarities are irrelevant. And then we could make decisions from one problem to another. So it may be easier to see the problem from an analogy, to see an analogous problem, take a decision there, and move the decision, import the decision to the problem that we want to analyze. And identifying always what doesn't fit, and if it doesn't fit, whether this is an important aspect of the problem or not. So let's get this lawful intercept. One analogy is it's like requiring everyone to record their face-to-face conversation. So is it? Now that's the question. So if the phone companies are required to wiretap every single phone calls, is it just like someone recording any conversations that we have with our friends on the streets, if we go for a walk inside of our houses? So is that ethical or not? This analogy is focused on voice over IP on Skype, for instance. Are there similarities between voice over IP and face-to-face conversations? That's one thing that we have to analyze. These are both forms of communications and meant to include a limited number of people. And is it possible for others to listen in? Is there easy access for others? And whether required recordings allow abuses by governments or hackers. These are the sorts of questions that we have to analyze in the analogy. Decisions about face-to-face conversations. In face-to-face conversations, so now that we found an analogy, is that lawful enforcement analogous to face-to-face conversations? Let's see that. Private conversations are not monitored routinely, and they can be monitored only with court order and probable cause. And we do not record all the conversations all the time. Implications with respect to the analogy with voice IP. The lawful intercept systems go beyond rules for private conversations. It's meant for them to be recording conversations all the time in every single conversations, not only conversations that are that had a court order to be recorded. Without LI, law enforcement can still monitor, as with face-to-face conversations, right? So the same case can happen. We don't need to enforce the telecommunication companies to allow this kind of to include this kind of methods, this kind of systems. Law enforcement can still monitor the conversations of everybody. Now, what are the problems with this analogy? This argument would apply to normal phone tapping. It's things that we learn to accept. Society accepts the need for some phone taps. So these are the closest point to the analogy to the to tapping every single conversations that we take over voice, over our Skypes or over mobile phones. But what features of the analogy don't work? Now, when you are on a face-to-face conversation, you're talking to someone else. There is no third party involvement or fourth party involvement. In the case that's the communications provider, it's you, the person that you're engaged in conversation, and maybe the law enforcement. But in this case, there is a difference. So you have a telecommunications provider that's going to be messing around with your communications, going to have access to your communication, access to your private conversations. So the analogy, it may be good for certain aspects, but it doesn't include an important aspect, that is the telecommunications provider. So we shouldn't look for another analogy that includes the middleman as needed. Let's look for analogy 2. LI is like suspicious activity reporting, that SAR in banking. Is it or is it not? Does this analogy work or not? That's what we're going to see. That's what you have to think, right? As I said at the beginning, I'm not in a position here to give my opinions. I'm in a position here to show you which aspects of the problem can be analyzed using this kind of analogical reasoning. So US banks must notify government when they see suspicious transactions. What are the similarities between the LI and the SAR? Both are critical resources for criminals and require the help of external law-abiding entity. Information helps to connect suspects with each other and discover networks of suspects, networks of crime. Problems with the analogy. Now, the actor that initiates sending the information to the law enforcement differs. In the case of the SAR, of the suspicious activity reporting in banking, the actor who initiates sending information are the banks, not the government. There's a clear distinction here. And the information provided is very different. Banks provide only times, dates, and the participants involved in the transactions, and not details of the full conversation. Right? The full conversation recording supplies a lot more details about the personal aspects, and this may be a problem if you think that there is a fourth party involved, the telecommunications company. Decision about suspicious activity reporting, then banks are only required to report suspicious activities, not all activities. That would be crazy, right? If the banks were required to report every single bank transactions, that would be crazy. So banks would only report suspicious activities. Implications by the analogy, telecommunications companies should be required to report suspicious activities. Imagine that. That would be, so the telecom companies would have to support storage of detailed call reports, and should not support storage of whole conversations, if we take the analogy literally, right? So banks, let me explain this better. So banks only provide times, dates, and participants. For this analogy to work, telecommunications companies should only send this type of records, the times, dates, and participants, and not the whole conversation. So again, is this analogy a good one to apply in your decision making? Is it not good? Which aspects are good? Which aspects can you use in your decision making? In deciding whether, let me recollect the problem. It's far behind. How does the decision to require lawful intercept software impact privacy and security? That's the question. So we made the analogy with the requirement to everyone record their face-to-face conversations, and what we did here, we brought up what are the similarities between face-to-face conversations, what are the dissimilarities between LI and face-to-face conversations, and then we looked for problems with the analogy, and then we looked for the analogy 2, which is LI, and it's analogous to suspicious activity reporting in banking. And we also brought up what are the similarities in this analogy, what are the dissimilarities with this analogy. Now, which decision can you take? Is it good or bad? Is it actually infringing my privacy, having my calls recorded at all times, or not? Is it the same as requiring phone calls to be wiretapped at some point, at some times? That's for you to decide. Now, after analyzing the analogies, we consider 3 possible options or solutions. We can require all voice over IP systems to implement lawful enforcement, do not require lawful intercept, and use physical eavesdropping, or require voice over IP providers to report only suspicious activities, but not the full conversation recordings. Okay, once we brought up some key aspects, so there are 3 possibilities. Now let's analyze the interested parties, the stakeholders. There's obviously the law enforcement. Monitoring saves time and money, can do their jobs better. The hackers or non-hacker criminals. The public, monitoring helps law enforcement but decreases privacy and perhaps safety. Now we have to take into account the stakeholders. Do the utilitarian analysis, who wins and who loses, given with respect to the stakeholders. For law enforcement, the option 1 is best. For the public, option 2 reduces police effectiveness. Option 1, which the full access, allows for abuses. And option 3 may also reduce police effectiveness. So what is the solution? It's for you to decide. It's an unethical decision. To reach a final decision, we should weigh how much harm hackers and rogue law enforcement and governments, rogue governments, could do considering each of the options available. Each of the options available. And this is exactly what the members of Congress, of the US Congress, went through when first drafting the CALEA, Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. And I'm not sure if a decision has been made and whether you agree with the decision or not. That's for you to decide. But now you have tools to allow your decision. You can use analogical reasoning. You have to take into account the stakeholders, and you take into account an utilitarian analysis. In the next video, we are going to see a third technique that you can use to help you on your ethical decision making. I'll see you there.